Hi everyone, this is Myriam Neaimeh from Newcastle University and the Alan Turing Institute. Welcome to our Supergen Smart Charging webinar. The current series is focusing on cybersecurity, and it is in collaboration with the International Energy Agency Task 43 on vehicle grid integration. The webinar series is an activity of the vehicle grid integration at the Alan Turing Institute. The Alan Turing is the National Institute in the UK for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. And one of the objectives of the Institute is to apply data science methods to real-world problems, such as what we are doing at the Vehicle Grid Integration Group, where we are supporting the decarbonization of transport and electricity infrastructure. Previously on the webinar, we had episodes focusing on communication protocols for electric vehicles. We also had talks focusing on strategies to roll out charging infrastructure regionally and nationally. Like last week, for example, we had speakers from Quebec. We also had companies speaking about their projects. And recently, we've been having a series of talks focusing on cybersecurity. We have a landing page where you can find the slides of the previous talks, and also a YouTube playlist where you can find the videos. This graph is showing the different entities and players involved in the e-mobility ecosystem. And I want to highlight 2 points. First, the importance of these different entities to speak a common language, or at least very few languages. Because if we get to a future where a certain type of cars are speaking one language and are only able to communicate with one type of charging infrastructure, then we are going to move towards a fragmented infrastructure, and we want to avoid that. So hence the importance of standardized open communication protocols. The other point I want to make is about data exchange. There is a lot of data that needs to be exchanged between these entities to ensure that these cars are charged and discharged when it's good for the system, and definitely when it's good for the user. So we have information flowing up from the electric vehicle, for example, through the charger, through the operator who controls that car, and control commands flowing down. So it is very important that the system is secure so that users trust the system, but also electricity operator trust the system. And on the webinar, we've talked about public key infrastructure that can help with trust. And we also have talks and are having talks to highlight the cyber threats and what we can do about them. So next week, it's going to be a talk on Internet of Things. And this week, I'm delighted to welcome Xavier Bellekens, who's going to talk to us about the cybersecurity in the vehicle industry and how we stay ahead of cyber threats. Xavier is a lecturer and Chancellor Fellow at the University of Strathclyde. His research is centered on threat detection, mitigation, and protection of critical infrastructure such as electricity and transport. And he's the Education Cybersecurity Thematic Leader and the Blockchain Group Chair of IEEE UK and Ireland. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Xavier.
Thank you, Myriam. I couldn't unmute myself.
Oh.
I'll start sharing my screen.
Meanwhile, if participants have questions, please leave them in the chat box and we'll take them at the end of the talk.
All right. All right, here we are. So thank you, Myriam, for inviting me. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
All right, perfect. So I'll be talking today, as Myriam said, about cybersecurity in the vehicular or automotive industries and how to stay ahead of threats, and I'll provide a couple of examples about the work that we've carried out in the automotive industry. So to supplement the nice biography that you've given, I'm indeed a lecturer at the University of Strathclyde and a Chancellor's Fellow. And my work focuses mainly on critical infrastructure. So vehicular is a part of it, but we also do work in naval, avionics, and power. And essentially on the detection, defense, and response to cyber threats for critical infrastructures. So some of the elements or some of the elements in the architectures are the same, so we can apply very similar techniques. And what we aim at is essentially learning from other domains and applying technologies and making sure that we do not repeat the same mistakes as before. So that's part of what I do at the University of Strathclyde. So today I'll talk about vehicles and why is automotive security important? Well, by 2025, we will have 500 million connected vehicles and 90 million autonomous vehicles will be on the road by 2030. We also know that the average longevity on the road of a vehicle is about 10 years. And it takes about 7 years to develop a car, right? So it means that the technology that we start with for cars that are being put on the road today are technologies that we've seen in 2013. And of course, there's updates, upgrades, they swap, they adapt based on the needs of customers. But a lot of that technology stays there. A lot of the core technology is the same. And we've seen this clear push also from the vehicular industry to become part of the Internet of Things ecosystem. And it's a fantastic idea to provide new services, and it provides new opportunities for customers, new services for end users, and the end users can obviously profit from all of those connected services. But it also means that those services will be on the road for a long time and will have to be supported for the 10 years ahead. So when we talk about, like, for example, cars that are on the road today, my car was produced in 2015. My car is connected in some ways, right? And I will probably keep that car after 2025 if everything goes well. Now, we also know that the longevity of IoT devices are 2 to 3 years, right? Because the technology evolves, the devices become obsolete, the services are stopping, and a number of services are also provided by third party. So when looking at the vehicular or automotive industry, we've got to be aware of all of those issues that we will face over this 10-year period. Now, aside from the connectivity, we also have complexity, right? New cars have over 150 million lines of code, and to provide a comparison, an F-22 Raptor fighter jet only contains about 2 million lines of code. And if we take like one of the most common fighter jets like the F-35, we have 30 million lines of code. And if we had not enough, 2015, Facebook was only 60 million lines of code. So there's this complexity and in programming, and this complexity in programming is quite interesting because it introduces bugs. And the more bugs we have, the more code we have, the higher the attack surface. And so not only do we have like more lines of code, we also have more computers, electronic control units. And ECUs are essentially embedded systems that control subsystems in the vehicle, for example, the doors or the powertrain or the speed control. And in very high-end cars, we've got like up to 200 ECUs. So that's a lot of computers to take care of. 10 years ago, we had around 60 ECUs as a comparison, and it's been increasing. I'm aware that my car has 112 ECUs, so that's quite a high number, and I'm expecting like most of the cars to have like around the same number, right? So the attack surface is way bigger than other critical infrastructure. And we've got to take this into account. So a couple of years ago, my team and I decided to have a look at the attack surface, and I've only listed here 2 slides out of the 10 that we had for the automotive industry. And these are all the things that can be hacked or could be potentially hacked. And we've got the engine control, airbag deployment, the cruise control, throttle control, parking system, lane correction, the regenerative brakes. And we've got like also things that are easier to hack than other ones, right? For example, the regenerative brakes are harder to hack than the remote key system or the keyless entry, or the TPMS, which is basically looking at the tire pressure. We also have like things that the user has access to, and malicious users could have access to, like Bluetooth, USB, OBD11, smartphone. So my car, I'm able to lock and unlock my car using my smartphone. And all of these services, all of these sensors, actuators, ECUs that we've got in the car are susceptible to contain vulnerabilities, susceptible to be hacked, and susceptible to have like a ripple effect. If one of them was going down, maybe it could affect more of those systems. So when we look at the attack surface, essentially, or when we did some work, we decided to go and have a look at understanding the attack vectors and having some due diligence, right? Understanding what was accessible, how accessible it was, and understanding the feasibility the feasibility of an attack within a time frame. So for example, externally, we've got Bluetooth sensors, Wi-Fi, we've got cellular, GPS, keyless, and there are attacks, for example, like against GPS that are extremely feasible, right? There's GPS spoofing, for example, but in the context of a car, GPS spoofing is not as harmful as in the context of the naval industry or the maritime industry, where they heavily rely on GPS or the power for synchronization. We have also internal attack vectors, where we've got the CAN bus or the MOST, which is the Media-Oriented System Transport Bus, which is essentially a high-speed multimedia network technology. We've got the LIN bus, which was developed by BMW, Volkswagen, Audi, Volvo, and Mercedes. And we've got the OBD11, and the OBD11 is a protocol, and it's a quite interesting one because that's the one that helps with diagnosis. So when you have an issue with your car, you can go to a garage or like, I think it's RAC that is getting dispatched, and they plug themselves on the OBD11 and they get the diagnosis of your car. And we can think about OBD11 as a language to talk over the controller area network, the bus, right? And the bus would then be a peripheral such as a phone, for example. So when we look at the CAN bus, this is essentially what it looks like. It's essentially 2 wires, and we have all of our ECUs connected to those 2 wires. And the CAN bus essentially interconnects everything, and it's a message-based protocol where all of the ECUs on the bus will receive all of the messages. They will check the messages, and then they will either accept or decline those messages. So if there are 2 messages sent at the same time, then like a priority, like the messages actually carry a priority. So let's assume that we have faulty wiring and we get like, we get a fire, an electrical fire. And at the same time, we've got like a defective window. Well, the electrical fire will take the precedence over the window because the priority will be higher. Now, while the canvas is great when it comes to adding new ECUs, it's not very secure. There's been numerous vulnerabilities demonstrated, and it's something that is becoming problematic. So if we look at a car, because discussing this, like quite often we discuss all the vulnerabilities of vehicular technologies, but quite often I get the question, how difficult is it to actually hack a car? So I thought I took this opportunity to discuss a bit more about a project that we worked on. We concluded in 2019, where my group explored the cybersecurity of the Skoda Octavia with one of our graduate students, Colin Urquhart. And actually the car in the picture is his car. And we published a paper that's now available on IEEE Access, and you can see the link at the bottom if you want to read more. And I thought I'd walk you through. But before I do this, for full disclosure, all of the vulnerabilities that are presented have been discussed with Skoda. And we've had actually very great support from their team, from the cybersecurity team, and their engagement has been fantastic, which has helped us while we were carrying out the work. And this has also motivated us to continue this work. And now we are in discussion with multiple manufacturers to report various vulnerabilities. And so, again, making the vehicular, sorry, I've got the word in French, but making the vehicular space a bit more secure. So to start with vehicular security, essentially what we did was starting to establish a methodology for the vehicular industry. And obviously we've got multiple vehicles, we've got truck, cars, lorry, and we wanted to have like an idea of what the attack surface was for each of those. And obviously it's a methodology that worked well for us. It's a methodology, if you look at hacking methodologies, you'll see that there's often 9 steps of the hacker. We decided to change this methodology and adapt it a bit more to what we were trying to do. Look at short-range wireless like Bluetooth, remote keyless entry, looking at the accessible user interfaces. So what could we poke? What could we touch? What could we modify? Internet access, and that was more about like, is the car connected? What does it connect to? Where does it connect? And is there an entry door for people to just poke around? And then the sensors and autonomy, such as like radar, LiDAR, and camera. And after looking, we actually came up with this attack surface. We wanted to look at the key fob. We wanted to have a look at the infotainment system, the onboard diagnostic port, so the OBD, and one of the ECUs. So we chose that knowing what we were planning ahead, right? Those were the goals that we had defined initially, and some of these attacks were already known. But what we wanted to know was, A, are they available on a high-end car? And can we weaponize those attacks? And when I mean weaponize, I'm essentially meaning, can we press a button and carry the attack out, right? Or do we need specialized knowledge to actually carry this attack? So to bypass the keyless entry or the key fob, you've got to bypass a rolling code. And the rolling code is essentially as follows, right? You press the button, and the code is sent to the car changes the code for the next rolling code, and the key changes the code. And if the codes don't match, then there is like some kind of rescheduling, and they get back to the same code. So it's a pretty simple concept. It's a concept that is not new. The rolling code has been implemented for years. but we wanted to know if it was still feasible and how difficult was it. So all it takes to actually bypass the rolling code is a yardstick, which basically helps jamming the signal from the key to the car, and a HEV1, which is a software-defined radio, and that allows us to capture and replay the signal. And then you've got two softwares, GQRX and New Radio, to actually isolate the signals and replay the signals with the HEV1, right? Now, you may think that this is a complicated task, but it turns out a lot of students are actually on 5G masters and or on comms masters, and they are learning about software-defined radio. And so it's not such a complicated task to capture the signal and replay it, and it can do a lot of damage. So for example, in France, there's been cases where items were stolen out of a car and the insurance would not intervene because nothing was broken. There's been multiple cases like this. So we wanted to know how easy it was and how difficult would it be to weaponize it. So here you can see basically the signal, and this is from the GNU radio tool. And the red dot at the bottom is basically the car key transmission. So if we look at this, we have the receiver's window, we've got the key transmission and the noise. And once you isolate the noise, you can see that that small red dot there is basically the key that is being pressed and opening the car. So going from there, once we had this small proof of concept and we were able to bypass the rolling code, we actually made it into a box, and we were able to repeat it by the single press of a button, taking like half a second to open and close cars. If you were on a parking, you'd be able to stop a number of cars to be closed and steal items within the cars. So we managed to weaponize it. We managed to actually demonstrate the weaponization. And it turns out that a couple of weeks after we had done this, and the research was not yet published, we found out a video of a Mercedes being stolen. And I don't know if you had the chance to see this video. It's from a video camera, and you've got hackers like having and robbers having a box in their hands, and they are trying to get the signal out of a key that's within a house to start the car. So not only did we weaponize it, but we weaponized it after people, after robbers. So it's something that was already known by robbers, and it is something that need to be changed because it's part of this attack surface. And obviously it's an attack surface that is being exploited at the moment. So we decided to look a bit further. And as I said, we wanted to look at the infotainment system. And the reason we wanted to look at the infotainment system was because a number of cars now requires you to, or allow you to connect your car to the Wi-Fi. So my car can be connected to an access point. It provides Wi-Fi within the car, so to passengers. So there's a number of, like, it can create an access point itself. And so we decided to connect the car to an access point and have a look at what was possible, what information could we retrieve, what vulnerabilities could be found. And so we used a couple of tools, like for active reconnaissance, Nmap and Sparta, and they're essentially port scanners. And what is a port scanner? A port scanner is you run a service, like for example, on your computer or on the car, and it needs a port to communicate. And the ports have different addresses. So for example, if you're surfing on the internet, you will be on port 80. And if you're using file transfer, you'll be on port 21. SSH will be port 22. So that the ports are defined up to a certain point. You can try to connect to those ports, and you can use like a tool called Netcat, and then like based on the service that is running, if it has a vulnerability, you can start exploiting it. So when we run Sparta against the Skoda, we found out that there were a couple of ports being opened. So you can see there's 1234, 15361, and you can also see the names. So the names, you can see hotline and SIP. SIP is essentially a port that if you've got a phone and it's plugged onto the network, so with an RG45 rather than an RG11, then it's probably using voice over IP, VoIP, and it's communicating with SIP. So those ports are identified as hotline and SIP because there might be ports used by SIP services on a computer. However, in this case, this was not the case, right? So we decided to have a look at those ports and connect to the port. And what we saw is that without having to authenticate, we were receiving enormous amounts of data. So we'd simply connect and the port would just give us the data. And the data were quite interesting because we managed to receive position, mileage, speed of the car. We also created a fake DNS, so the domain name server. For example, when you try to browse a website that you've never visited, it actually creates like a DNS request. And here we saw that the car was connected to odconnect.de. And there was a lot of data being generated that we've still not fully investigated. It also provided information about vCards. So vCards are like contacts from your phone. And with Apple CarPlay, we had access to dial number, missed calls, audio track selected, plethora of information that if an attacker was connected to your network, let's assume that your computer was vulnerable and had been hacked for a reason, the attacker would scan the network and could connect to your car if the car was obviously connected to your Wi-Fi, and then gather these information. So this is quite an interesting attack vector. We also looked at other ports, and here we can see that on port 49101, we actually had a web server. And while we looked at the web server, we tried to do directory listing. So directory listing is trying a couple of directories to see if the web server provides any information. And what we found out is that, again, there were more directories, like here we can see avt.info, avt.action, avt.event, which might be waiting for actions and events or spilling information about actions and events. And we found numerous information and similar information to the speed or to the vCards. So those information were repetitive, but the fact is that we could gather them from 2 different locations. And it also provided additional paths that we did explore with numerous other information, and those are all detailed, by the way, in the paper. One of the ports, though, was accepting connections, and we also figured out that it looked like there was a vulnerability on the port. And by running Metasploit, which is essentially an automated way of exploiting a device, we managed to obtain a shell, and a shell means that we had admin privileges. And as you can see here, we obtained the shell, but no information were investigated. We didn't investigate further because the car was still under warranty, and we didn't want it to do something that could essentially break the car. But this demonstrates the vulnerabilities that an infotainment can have, and the issues that lie with having like third-party infotainment that might not be controlled or the security might not be looked at as much as other components in a car. We then moved on to our OBD port, and on the OBD port we did quite a bit of research beforehand, and we found a number of articles that say that, for example, it was almost impossible to sniff information from the CAN bus on a Volkswagen. So we had a look, and we figured out that Volkswagen was using Volkswagen TP2 protocol, and each time we were trying to connect, indeed, we were refused. We were refused any connection. So we decided to approach the problem in a different manner. Some devices do work really well with Volkswagen, so there was a way of initiating that connection. So we started having a look at the protocols and the details of the protocols, like what was a broadcast, how the channel was being set up, the channel parameters, the data transmission, and we realized quite quickly that we were facing a gateway module, something we had to establish. We had to establish the communication before we were able to communicate on the CAN bus. So after a bit of reverse engineering, we found out that by sending, for example, the CAN ID 0x200 with the following data packet, the connection was achieved. And what information could we gather there? We were able to gather information about the speed. So we put the car on a roller and we gathered information about like the doors being opened. We gathered information about the speed of the car. We were able to modify the start and stop of the engine. So this was quite interesting because there were data that we were able to modify and data that we were able to gather. And this shows that a simple, I think simple, it might not be the best word, but spending some time on the problem allowed us to find numerous vulnerabilities. And despite the restrictions that were placed or put in place by the Volkswagen Group to avoid this, there was a different way that we adopted to gather this information. And this is quite important because when we are talking about attackers, we do not know how much time they have on their hands to be able to exploit a service, a device, or an application. And so sometimes we might think that the security feature that we put in place is good enough. But in fact, the attacker might have twice as much time as we have to exploit that vulnerability. And with more time, we could probably find different and maybe more exploitable or more vulnerabilities. We then moved on to the ECU, and here we looked at the Bosch electronic diesel control, so the EDC17. And what we wanted to see was what could we do there? And of course, there has been a number of companies that were able to reprogram the ECU to deliver more power, to reduce consumption, and to modify the car in various different ways. And so we decided to have a look ourselves and see if we could modify the power distribution. So here you can see the original power of the car and then the modified power distribution of the car. We've got it in a different way as well here, right? And this is the engine RPMs that we can see and the torque, and you can see that the torque has been modified in comparison to the engine RPMs. And while these might not be the most impressive attacks, we do believe that these can totally be weaponized and these can be exploited further. And so we looked at obtaining information of the cars, we demonstrated vulnerabilities, and we thought, well, what other attack vectors can find vulnerabilities? What other attack vectors can we exploit in a car? And not long after asking that question, we thought about the entire ecosystem surrounding the car. There is an infrastructure complexity to a car. It's not a boat that goes at sea for 6 months and then comes back. You actually go to the garage, we have interaction, we've got a lot of interactions, it's not isolated. Some people park their cars in the street, some have them in the garage, some will connect them to Wi-Fi or to an access point. We will put them to a charging station. So there is a lot more. So one of the attack vectors that we quickly looked at is this small device that is being sold on Amazon for a couple of pounds. And basically it promises you like a lower fuel consumption, a couple more horsepower, and a lot more. And you can find them this multiple versions of this. And you plug them on the OBD port, that we had just exploited. And we got one of those devices, we opened them, we opened the devices, and we quickly realized that there's actually nothing within those devices. Those devices do not do anything. They do not transmit data. They do not gather any data. But if you were to weaponize one of the previous attacks, this device is an excellent choice. Because a lot of people will plug them without looking into their OBD port, and it could greatly damage the car or the user. We then had a quick look at infected garage laptops, and we contacted a couple of garages, and we wondered if there was a possibility to infect a car from a garage. And obviously these laptops do run proprietary software, they run interesting software, and given the right delivery system, they are perfect to weaponize the attacks that we've discussed with, because you will have an impact on an entire fleet of vehicles. Not only will you plug your laptop into a single vehicle, some of those garages are like the guys that, the operators that carry those laptops, they see up to 20 people a day, and they will plug their laptops to up to 20 cars a day. So that's a perfect way of weaponizing some of these attacks. So not only did we found like a number of attack vectors, we also had not explored a number of other attack vectors, like vehicle-to-vehicle communication, vehicle-to-device communication, vehicle-to-home, vehicle-to-grid, vehicle-to-pedestrian, vehicle-to-infrastructure. The automotive sector is evolving so rapidly that the attack surface is increasing at an exponential rate, making it like very difficult for security researchers to keep up with the threats that are possible and understand the technology that is behind, like vehicle-to-vehicle, vehicle-to-device, vehicle-to-home. Like vehicle-to-home is, for example, you get an accident, calls home. Vehicle-to-devices, your car could communicate with a bike. Vehicle to the grid, when you're plugging yourself on the charging station or need to charge. Vehicle to pedestrian or vehicle to infrastructure. There are like an increasing amount of possibilities for exploitation. And recently we were talking with a couple of manufacturers, and they told us, oh, well, we are moving to Automotive Ethernet. And we thought, well, this is fantastic, because first of all, there's been a lot of mistakes made on Ethernet. So Ethernet is the backbone of the internet. You probably have an RG45 cable plugged into your router today, or you might be using Wi-Fi and TCP/IP. And like we thought, well, this is fantastic. But then at the same time, we still see so many cyber attacks taking place on the internet and taking advantage of Ethernet. So we've got to understand that we need to have a robust architecture. We need to understand the implication of real-time data or time-sensitive networks, because obviously when we are surfing the web, we don't need time-sensitive networking. Now, the great thing is that Ethernet has been applied in other sectors and other critical infrastructures. And so there are lessons to be learned there to adapt onto the automotive sector. and to improve reliability, privacy, confidentiality, availability, controllability, observability, and operability. So while it's a great move, it will need to be done in a fashion where we look at the past and we understand the mistakes that other sectors have done in the past in order to be able to develop a secure architecture. And this is very important. Because, for example, now we are talking, like when we are talking about cybersecurity, we talk about like redundancy, we talk about decentralization, the distribution of functions, and these are key to be integrated in the future developments. And as I said at the start, it takes 7 years for developing a car, and the car is going to be on the road for 10 years. So these developments will have to take place in a fast evolving sector. And we have to understand the entire infrastructure before we make those developments. So now if we take a step back and we look a bit at charging stations, and I thought that I'd give like a bit of information about the work there. Well, it's great because within charging station, we already see TLS. There's plenty of talks where we talk about security, that talk about security of charging stations, that talk about TLS, that talk about IPv6, that talk about ISO 15118, and protocols such as OCPP and WebSockets. But it turns out WebSockets has vulnerability itself. So during these implementations, we will have to understand again the complexity of these infrastructures. And when we look at the charging station, where we've got our car coming to the charging station might be connected through the internet to the backend. It increases the complexity of that infrastructure tremendously. And this is what Myriam was talking at the start with like our figure about the energy data access and control flows. Right? We have the communication between the car and the charging station, but this is not the only one. We do have the user. The user plays a big role, and the user might have his mobile. And I remember in one of the previous talks, we were talking about IOTA being used for charging stations for payment. So the complexity of these infrastructures are increasing tremendously. We then have like communications between the charging station, the internet, and maybe a charging station operator. We will have like charging station in the backend, and obviously rollout, like there will be update rollouts, there will be upgrades, and all of these information need to be taken into account. And then finally, the charging station will be connected to distribution system operators. And so this adds to the mix of the cascading effects cyber attacks might have in the future, and the ripple effect one successfully achieved cyber attack could have on an entire infrastructure. Starting with something that might be very small at the start, but this is why we've got to have a look at the global infrastructure. So what do we do at the moment to stop those cyber attacks? Well, we define attack vectors. At the moment, we are looking at the cascading effect and how these attacks propagate from the vehicle to the garage, from the factory to the consumer, from the consumer to the garage, and so on and so forth. We are trying to establish and identify what are the most likely attack vectors to be exploited. We are measuring the forensic ability of components. We are having like a very complex environment with numerous devices that are subject to cyber attacks. What's important is that we understand the consequences of these cyber attacks. And if a cyber attack hits, we need to be able to understand where it started from. And the only way to do that is to gather forensic data. We will have to have like some accountability and understand what data can we gather at this time to point where the attack started and how we can stop it and how we can make sure that the rest of the infrastructure stays safe. And then, of course, we will have to look at Automotive Ethernet, which is being rolled out in replacement or in conjunction of CAN and LIN buses. And we have to understand what it means for the automotive industry to bring the Ethernet, within the automotive industry. And this brings up new questions, because on Ethernet, we use intrusion detection systems. So our group develops packet inspections and anomaly detection systems. So how can we integrate those technologies that have been well developed on Ethernet into new infrastructures? And finally, one of the way we look at security at the moment and look at threats, we do threat hunting. We have like SOCs, like security operations centers, that are working towards monitoring cyber attacks. So what we are developing essentially are SOCs for cars, detecting attacks on fleets using our attack trees and allowing us to understand the cascading effects and bringing all of this into a mix. So ideally, bringing what we've learned for the last 40 years of cybersecurity into the automotive industry, and bringing what the lessons and the mistakes, learning from the lessons and the mistakes that we've done in the past in other critical infrastructures, to make sure that the automotive industry is as reliable as possible in the future. So in summary, we do have a complex ecosystem. The ecosystem is going to become more complex over time. There are numerous legacy systems and innovations that will have to work side by side due to the development times and the longevity of cars and other services available. We will have to understand those domains of interactions and how all of those domains interact together. We have to adopt these security by design solutions. It will be essential for adopting security by design from the get-go, and not having cybersecurity as something that is a side gig. And we've got to learn from other critical infrastructures and the mistakes that we've made in the past in order to develop those new systems. And that is me.
Thank you so much, Xavier. On the last point, you said the main learning. Maybe you can share again one of the main learning that would stick with us as maybe a takeaway message.
I think the main learning point would be to look at the lessons learned from other critical infrastructures, because Ethernet has been adapted in a number of other critical infrastructures. Ethernet has suffered, like there's so many vulnerabilities that it's difficult to list them all. And having the ability to say, all right, we are aware of these vulnerabilities on Ethernet. We are aware that services can be exploited in this way, and these are the corrective steps or the actions we can take to make the system secure is going to be essential. It's great to develop something from scratch. Don't get me wrong. I think it's great that the automotive industry is moving forward to have these new services and bring Ethernet and simplify the number of ECUs. But at the same time, we've got to look at the mistakes that we've done. And by looking at those mistakes, we can actually make systems much better, because quite often in industries, we don't look at other industries. We just go like, all right, let's go with implementing Ethernet, and we might ignore, because it's an instinct, right? We might ignore what has been done before and problems that have been solved in other places. And so I think that the main learning point is looking at the mistakes we've done before and making sure that we do not replicate them, because there's no point of reinventing the wheel.
What is the main other, was it maybe power systems?
Well, it's been in power systems, it's been in naval as well. Interestingly enough, a lot of critical industry share the same issues. a lot of critical infrastructures do share the same issues. And while they are totally different in some ways, bringing Ethernet, and I wouldn't like to point one sector, point the finger at one sector, because from when we discuss with power operators or energy operators, and when we discuss with the maritime sector, we see the same mistakes, and it's the same mistakes that we see in the healthcare and the banking sector, right? So I think. And there's no good mechanism at the moment to learn from sector to sector. But recently, I met someone that was working in the automotive sector, and decided for a total career change. And he became like an administrator, a network administrator, and he saw exactly the same mistakes. He saw exactly the same issues, right? So we've got to take this into account.
Got it. In the automotive sector, do you see a trend towards increasing the teams who are working on security?
Yes, we see quite there's a number. So with all the manufacturers we are talking with, they now have dedicated teams. They understand. They are starting to understand that bringing connectivity is great, but it also brings a risk. And I think it's the right approach, because quite often when systems are segregated, security is not taken into account from the get-go. The automotive industry, on the other hand, I think has been taking the right approach by integrating cybersecurity, and we see now see even some paragraphs in the manuals, in some car manuals about the cybersecurity and privacy of data, and I think that that's the right approach, right? Now, what would be good would be if there was a way for different industries to communicate together and discuss the cybersecurity or the advances in cybersecurity they are having. So in the automotive industry, for example, there are a couple of initiatives that have now grown, whether they are like from the automotive industry or from hacker, like there's the car hacking village at DEF CON, for example, where we've got hackers coming together and talking about car hacking. And there's a couple of representatives from the automotive industry. There's also a couple of passionates that are there showing what vulnerabilities they found. And all of these initiatives contribute to the security of the automotive industry. And so we do see this growing interest from the automotive industry to be secure. Thank you.
I received a question on the CAN protocol. So with the vehicle to grid, the CHAdeMO protocol uses CAN, and I'm wondering if it is possible to introduce security features on the CAN communication for the CHAdeMO protocol.
So that's a very interesting question, because it's about like it is a bit like retrofitting security, and the issue that we often discuss with colleagues and manufacturers about retrofitting cybersecurity is what is the impact of retrofitting cybersecurity, right? So personally,
apology to interrupt. Can you explain why this is retrofitting security, and what does that entail?
All right. So, okay. So the CAN bus is like it's a pretty well established bus, right? There's been attempt at securing the CAN bus. There's multiple attempts, and I can probably share some of the links. And I think the best way of securing devices is to bring security from the start, right? And start from a clean slate. Now, at the same time, reinventing, as I said, myself, reinventing the wheel wouldn't work. So we've got to make sure that when we are implementing security, we are not doing a retrofit, because often when we are applying security afterwards, right, once something has been developed, we then end up with something that is quite often more clunky than it was before. And this is what I'm afraid when people say, oh, well, what about securing the canvas? What can we do there? What can we apply to make security better? I think, and this is obviously a very personal opinion, yes, it's better than nothing, but at the same time, we should look at security from a clean slate. We should look at security from a design standpoint, and security should be at the start of, should be integrated from the start of the design.
Okay, got it. So if I wanted to take this a bit further, I have two questions then. Security by design is definitely better, but we are where we are, and CAN is being used for V2G. How can we secure it? That's one question. The second question is, what is the alternative if we don't want to retrofit security? And we have to use, so do we have to move from using CAN?
Well, I like those are two very good questions, right? And I think I might be the wrong person to answer those questions. I can give you an opinion. So for the first question that you mentioned, for the first question, I would think that we don't have anything better, right, at the moment. So it's a good start, but unfortunately, it's maybe something that we should have taken into account from the design phase, right? And the problem is that, as we discussed, the development phase for all of those services take a couple of years quite often, and so the behavior or the mindset might be different from year to year. We see evolution in services, and I think that because we've got nothing better, we should be probably convening with experts from different fields and see what other solutions or what other working solutions have been applied, right? And the reason I think comes back to learning from others, from other sectors. We have other sectors that face exactly the same issues, right? And those sectors do try to secure their infrastructures as well. And there's probably more in a couple of brains than in a single one. And so it could, in my opinion, be fruitful to have intersector discussions. And interestingly enough, some sectors are actually starting to do this. And I'd like to talk about quickly about the defense sector that invites people from different backgrounds and different horizons to solve their problems, because it allows them to think behind the boundaries of their problem and not to be restricted to what they know of. And I think this is a very interesting approach. Having a think tank, for example, with multiple people trying to solve the same problem from different sectors might be the right solution, because it will open ideas. It will enlighten or shed light on issues that they've already faced. And this might allow to progress those discussions. And so I think this would be the answer, is that no, we don't have anything else, but So yes, we should retrofit cybersecurity. If this was your if we've got nothing, then let's retrofit cybersecurity. But let's make sure that the next iteration we've taken cybersecurity at the design phase and we've implemented security from the design phase. And I'm sure that there are plenty of working groups that would be able to contribute. And if we are going to retrofit cybersecurity, then let's get a couple of people in a room, people with different backgrounds coming to solve the same problem. And this might provide a way to accelerate those discussions.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you'd like to add, including where can people find more about your work?
Yes, so I think at the start of the slide, there's my email address. So like I've got a Google Scholar profile for anybody that wants to read some of the work. But if you've got any questions regarding the presentation or regarding what I've been discussing, then like feel free to drop me an email and I'll be happy to respond.
I'll probably definitely drop you an email to ask about those links about account security.
No worries. Thank you, Myriam.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.